I think it's pretty outrageous. Trans rights are not a left or Marxist agenda. They are a human rights issue. And we have to start from the principle of what is in the best interest of the child. The welfare of the child comes first. And we know that young trans children, no one's taught them to be trans. No one's persuaded them or pressured them. It's the way they feel they are. And of course, some people may think they're trans for a period and then decide they're not. But the ones who want to move on and make a permanent commitment to being trans, they have thought about it very long and hard. It's deeply rooted in their psyche. This is not a whim or a fancy. It's not the response to any pressure or any fad or fashion. It is something about who they are. And trans people have existed throughout history. It's nothing new. It's just that now trans people are coming out and claiming their rights, and so they should.
We're seeing a growing number of children claim that they're of the opposite sex than that of their birth. At what age do you think that children start to think about gender identity?
Well, first of all, it is nonsense to say this is a huge wave of new trans kids. It's not. Right. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny minority, well less than half of 1%. And the fact that, it is more than in the past is simply because trans kids now feel the confidence to speak out. Mm-hmm. Before they suffered in silence. They felt ashamed. They were guilty. They felt embarrassed. And that was a terrible thing to inflict upon young trans kids. So I welcome the fact that more of them are now out and open. And I just think we just have to listen to those young kids. They are very clear, very firm in their feeling that their gender is different from what they were assigned at birth. And they've struggled with it for many, many years. They haven't wanted to be this way. They haven't chosen to be this way. It is just who they are.
So, when it comes to education, explain the difference between being transgender and being gender fluid, and how is gender identity taught in schools today to actually reflect that?
Well, there's a number of issues here. I mean, it is true that there are male and female persons, and there are also intersex persons. And on top of that, there are trans people. And then there are those who see themselves as gender fluid or non-binary. I am welcoming the fact that people no longer feel pushed into boxes. These arbitrary categories of gender conformism, of masculine and feminine, those are from the dark ages. They were very, very damaging to young people who didn't fit those neat categories. And the fact that some people want to define themselves as gender fluid or gender nonconformist or non-binary, why not? Let them be. They're not hurting anybody else. In a free society where we value individual freedom and personal liberty, people should have the right to be their own self-definition. Mm-hmm. They shouldn't have to conform to the way history has traditionally required people to behave. Those traditional categories of male and female have been very, very oppressive. People who haven't fitted into those categories have felt very excluded, marginalized, and often suffered great prejudice and discrimination. Mm-hmm. I'm really glad we're moving beyond that.
Right. This woman's rhetoric is highly transphobic, but some critics say that she does make a point when it comes to child education. In your opinion, when is a child's mind developed enough to decide whether or not they want to, take on physical therapy like hormone therapy or surgery or some type of actual physical change to their gender identity or their presenting identity?
Well, first, let me just answer the question you asked before. Different schools teach these issues in different ways.
Right.
It is not a major issue in schools, but obviously some schools, or more increasing numbers of schools, recognize that there may be trans pupils. And indeed, I've been and talked at many schools where there are trans pupils, and they feel a duty of care that those trans pupils need to be affirmed and supported. So nothing wrong in that. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of when it's appropriate, well, of course, every individual must be assessed. Some people will be mature and understanding about this issue at quite a young age, maybe 8 or 9, others not until they're 13, 14 or 15. So the important thing is for individual assessment. And always, of course, and this is what happens in reality, is young people who present as trans, they are talked through and counseled about the issue, the pros and cons, very exhaustively, because no therapist or counselor or psychologist or doctor wants to push any child in this direction when they're not already inclined. And even those who feel very strongly, they are challenged and questioned. People ask them, are you sure about this? These are the potential consequences. This particular treatment may be irreversible in the long term. And so the decision when it's arrived at, particularly for younger people, is usually with the young person and their parents being consulted and coming to an agreement. There's no rush or pressure about it whatsoever.
How can parents support their children if they do come out as transgender, while making sure that they also do have enough time to discover themselves?
Well, I think it's very important that parents are supported, because we know from the research that young trans kids who are not supported have very high levels of anxiety, depression, and even suicidal thoughts, and in some cases do actually attempt suicide because they feel so neglected, rejected, and misunderstood. And that is not in the interest of any child. So parental support and school support is very, very, very important. And of course, as most parents do, they talk through these issues very extensively over many weeks, months, and even years to understand their child and to make sure that the child themselves feels comfortable and firm and clear in their decision. I know someone who has a trans child, and she has spoken with this child, as has the father, for 4 years, discussing it regularly, looking at all the pros and cons, so that they can be absolutely sure that their child has made the right choice. And I think that is the responsible attitude that most parents take.